The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Marcus Caldwell emerged from his black Mercedes, adjusting his $3,000 Italian suit with the satisfaction of a man who had never known defeat. His platinum Rolex caught the light as he smoothed his silver hair, every movement calculated to project the authority of someone worth $47 million. Behind him, his attorney Jonathan Brewster gathered leather portfolios with the efficiency of a man billing $800 per hour, his sharp eyes already scanning the courthouse entrance for any sign of weakness from the opposition. Marcus paused at the base of the steps, savoring this moment before his inevitable victory. 15 years of marriage to Elena would end today, and he would walk away with everything intact while she scrambled for scraps. The prenuptial agreement he had pressured her to sign all those years ago would protect his empire, leaving her with nothing more than the clothes on her back and a harsh lesson about marrying above her station. I want to pause here for just a moment and ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Are you in a place where justice feels far away sometimes? Comment below and let me know what state or country you are tuning in from, because what happens next is going to restore your faith that arrogance always gets what is coming to it. Across the courthouse plaza, Elena Moreau sat quietly on a wooden bench, her simple navy dress and worn leather purse painting the picture of a woman defeated before the battle had even begun. Her dark hair was pulled back in a modest bun, and her hands rested calmly in her lap as she watched Marcus strut toward the building like a peacock displaying his feathers. To any observer, she appeared to be exactly what Marcus claimed she was, a woman who had married for security and was now facing the consequences of her husband's wandering eye and growing cruelty. What none of them knew, what Marcus had never bothered to discover in his arrogance, was that Elena Moreau had spent the last 15 years playing a role as carefully constructed as any Broadway performance. Her calm exterior masked calculations that would have impressed the most ruthless business strategist, and her apparent helplessness concealed resources that dwarfed Marcus's considerable fortune. Marcus approached the courthouse entrance with Jonathan at his side, already rehearsing the narrative they would present to Judge Richardson. Elena had been a burden, a beautiful ornament who had contributed nothing to the marriage except mounting expenses and social embarrassment. Her family background was modest at best, her education unremarkable, and her work history non-existent. She had lived as a parasite on his success for 15 years, and now she would learn what happened to parasites when their host grew tired of them. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the quiet efficiency of justice being processed, lawyers conferring in hushed tones with their clients, clerks managing paperwork that would determine the course of human lives. Marcus moved through this environment like a shark in familiar waters, nodding to colleagues who recognized his reputation in the business community. His confidence was infectious, spreading to Jonathan, who smiled with the satisfaction of a man about to bill substantial hours for what would essentially be a formality. Elena entered the building moments later, accompanied by a nervous young man in an ill-fitting suit who carried a worn briefcase that had seen better decades. Thomas Mitchell was a public defender, assigned to Elena's case by the court when she had claimed inability to afford private counsel. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed his notes, clearly intimidated by the prospect of facing Jonathan Brewster in open court. The mismatch was so obvious that several observers actually felt sympathy for Elena before proceedings had even begun. Marcus took his seat at the plaintiff's table with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he chose. His wedding ring had been removed weeks ago, the pale band of skin where it once rested now tanned to match the rest of his hand. He had moved Vanessa Sterling into the family home just days after Elena had been forced to relocate to a modest apartment across town, making no effort to hide his disdain for the woman who had once shared his bed and his name. Vanessa herself sat in the gallery behind Marcus, her bleached blonde hair perfectly styled and her designer outfit chosen specifically to contrast with Elena's modest appearance. At 28, she was nearly 20 years younger than Elena, with the kind of aggressive beauty that demanded attention and the calculating intelligence of someone who had identified a target and moved in for the kill. She whispered encouragement to Marcus, already planning how she would redecorate once Elena was completely out of the picture. Judge Richardson entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who had presided over hundreds of divorce proceedings, his gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the appearance of a man who had seen every variation of human greed and disappointment. He reviewed the preliminary documents with practiced efficiency, noting the significant disparity between the legal representation on each side and the unusual circumstances of Elena's claimed indigence. Jonathan rose to present his opening statement, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent dismantling the claims of inconvenient spouses. He painted Elena as a classic gold digger who had targeted Marcus for his wealth and was now attempting to claim assets she had never earned through what he termed parasitic opportunism. His words were carefully chosen to portray her not just as undeserving, but as actively harmful to Marcus's continued success. Marcus watched Elena's reaction to these accusations with satisfaction, expecting to see the familiar signs of a woman broken by the weight of truth. Instead, he found her sitting with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout their marriage, her hands folded in her lap and her attention focused on Judge Richardson rather than the character assassination taking place just feet away. Something about her stillness bothered him in a way he could not quite identify, a subtle wrongness that scratched at the edge of his consciousness like a song played in the wrong key. Thomas Mitchell's response was halting and poorly organized, his nervousness evident as he attempted to argue that Elena deserved consideration for her years of support and companionship. His presentation lacked the polish and authority of Jonathan's opening, reinforcing the narrative that Elena was fighting a battle she could not possibly win. Even sympathetic observers began to resign themselves to witnessing a legal massacre. What Marcus failed to notice, what his arrogance prevented him from seeing, was the brief smile that crossed Elena's lips when Thomas mentioned her family background. It was gone so quickly that even trained observers might have missed it, but for just a moment, Elena Moreau looked like a woman who knew something that no one else in the courtroom had discovered. That smile carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had waited 15 years for this exact moment, someone who had allowed her opponent to build his confidence so high that the fall would be all the more devastating. The morning proceeded exactly as Marcus had anticipated, with Jonathan systematically presenting evidence of Elena's dependence and his client's generous support of a woman who had contributed nothing measurable to their shared life. Bank statements showed Elena's accounts remained modest while Marcus's business empire had flourished. Real estate records confirmed that every significant asset remained in Marcus's name alone, and witness statements from business associates painted Elena as a social burden who had never understood or supported Marcus's professional ambitions. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he watched Elena absorb these revelations, certain that she was finally understanding the hopelessness of her position. He had planned this destruction carefully, moving assets and preparing documentation that would leave her with no legal standing to claim any portion of his wealth. The prenuptial agreement they had signed would protect everything he had built, and she would learn the cost of challenging a man who had never lost a battle that mattered. But Elena Moreau continued to sit in perfect stillness, her dark eyes focused on some point beyond the immediate proceedings, as if she were listening to a conversation that no one else could hear. Her public defender shuffled papers nervously and took notes with increasing desperation, but Elena herself seemed almost detached from the systematic demolition of her character and claims. She was waiting for something, though what that might be remained a mystery to everyone in the courtroom, including the man who had shared her bed for 15 years without ever truly knowing who she was. Jonathan Brewster rose from his seat with the fluid confidence of a predator moving in for the kill, his leather portfolio crackling as he extracted a thick stack of financial documents that would serve as the foundation for Elena's complete humiliation. The afternoon lights streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to spotlight his performance as he approached the evidence table, each movement calculated to demonstrate the overwhelming superiority of his preparation compared to the meager defense mounted by Elena's clearly overwhelmed public defender. The first exhibit was a comprehensive analysis of Elena's financial dependency over their 15-year marriage, presented with the clinical precision of a medical examiner documenting a corpse. Bank statements showed Elena's personal accounts had never exceeded $3,000 at any given time, while Marcus's business empire had grown from $12 million to $47 million during the same period. Credit card records revealed Elena's spending patterns focused entirely on household necessities and modest personal expenses, painting the picture of a woman who had lived entirely within the allowance granted by her husband's generosity. Marcus shifted in his chair, adjusting his silk tie with the satisfaction of watching a perfectly executed plan unfold exactly as designed. He had spent months preparing this financial narrative, carefully documenting Elena's dependence while ensuring that his own assets remained completely protected by the prenuptial agreement she had signed in what now seemed like naive trust. Every transaction, every investment, every business decision had been structured to demonstrate that Elena Moreau had contributed absolutely nothing measurable to the accumulation of wealth that would soon be entirely his to control. Jonathan's voice carried across the courtroom with the authority of someone presenting indisputable facts rather than mere arguments. Elena had maintained no career during their marriage, contributed no income to their household, and participated in no business decisions that had generated the wealth she now hoped to claim through divorce proceedings. Her daily routine had consisted entirely of what Jonathan termed lifestyle maintenance activities: shopping for household items, attending social functions as Marcus's companion, and managing domestic staff who handled the actual work of maintaining their estate. Elena listened to this character assassination with the same mysterious calm she had maintained throughout the morning, her hands folded in her lap and her attention focused on Judge Richardson rather than the attorney systematically destroying her reputation. Thomas Mitchell frantically scribbled notes as Jonathan presented each piece of evidence, his nervous energy contrasting sharply with Elena's still composure. She appeared to be listening to something beyond the immediate proceedings, as if the systematic demolition of her character was merely background noise to a more important conversation taking place in her mind. The next phase of Jonathan's presentation focused on Elena's family background, delivered with the subtle disdain of someone discussing a particularly unfortunate social phenomenon. Elena's parents had operated a small import business in Portland that had struggled financially throughout Elena's childhood, eventually declaring bankruptcy when she was 17 years old. Her education had been completed at public institutions with modest academic achievements, and her work history before marriage consisted entirely of entry-level positions in retail and hospitality that had provided barely enough income to support basic living expenses. Marcus allowed himself a small smile as he remembered his first meeting with Elena at a charity fundraiser where she had been working as a server for the catering company. She had been 25 years old, beautiful in an understated way that appealed to his desire for elegance without ostentation, and clearly impressed by his wealth and social position. Their courtship had been swift and decisive, driven by his assumption that he was rescuing her from a life of financial uncertainty in exchange for her beauty and companionship. Jonathan's voice took on an almost paternal tone as he described Marcus's generous decision to marry Elena despite the obvious disparity in their social and economic backgrounds. Marcus had provided her with a lifestyle far beyond anything her family could have imagined, relocating her from a cramped apartment to a 7-bedroom estate, introducing her to social circles where individual pieces of jewelry cost more than most people earned in a year, and supporting her complete transition from working-class struggle to upper-class comfort. The evidence continued with documentation of Marcus's business achievements during their marriage, presented as proof that Elena's presence had contributed nothing to his continued success. Caldwell Industries had expanded into international markets, acquired 3 smaller competitors, and established manufacturing partnerships that had tripled their annual revenue. Marcus had negotiated these deals personally, traveled extensively to build relationships with foreign investors, and worked 16-hour days to build an empire that now employed over 800 people across 4 countries. Elena's contribution to this remarkable success, Jonathan explained with barely concealed contempt, had consisted entirely of attending social functions where she smiled appropriately and avoided embarrassing her husband in front of his business associates. She had never attended board meetings, never reviewed financial statements, never participated in strategic planning sessions, and never demonstrated any understanding of the complex international business relationships that had generated the wealth she now hoped to claim. Vanessa Sterling shifted in her seat behind Marcus, her perfectly manicured nails drumming silently against her designer purse as she imagined the life that awaited her once this legal formality was concluded. She had already selected paint colors for the master bedroom, chosen new furniture for the living areas, and planned renovations that would erase every trace of Elena's presence from what would soon be their shared home. Marcus had promised her everything Elena was losing, and Vanessa had the youth and sophistication to appreciate luxuries that Elena had simply taken for granted. Thomas Mitchell attempted to object to several characterizations of Elena's contributions, his voice cracking slightly under the pressure of challenging Jonathan's systematic presentation. His arguments focused on the intangible value of emotional support and household management, concepts that sounded increasingly desperate when measured against the concrete evidence of financial dependency. Judge Richardson listened to these objections with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments in countless divorce proceedings, but his expression suggested little sympathy for claims that could not be quantified in dollars and cents. The most damaging evidence came in the form of witness statements from Marcus's business associates, each one carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative of Elena's irrelevance to his professional success. These men described Marcus as a focused entrepreneur whose dedication to business excellence had never wavered despite the challenges of managing a wife who showed no interest in understanding or supporting his professional ambitions. They painted Elena as a social ornament who had failed to develop the sophisticated understanding of business and finance that would have made her a true partner in Marcus's success. Marcus rose to testify on his own behalf, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having his words carry weight in any room he entered. He described 15 years of supporting Elena financially, while she contributed nothing measurable to their shared life except her presence at social functions where his business was often discussed and negotiated. His testimony was delivered with the confidence of someone presenting obvious facts rather than disputed claims, each statement reinforced by the documentary evidence Jonathan had presented throughout the afternoon. The most devastating moment came when Marcus described his decision to provide Elena with what he termed adequate support during their separation, a monthly allowance that covered basic living expenses while she adjusted to the reality of life without access to his wealth. His tone suggested generous concern for someone who had become accustomed to luxuries she had never earned, while his words made clear that even this modest support would end permanently once their divorce was finalized. Elena's reaction to this testimony puzzled several observers who had expected to see signs of distress or anger in response to such systematic character destruction. Instead, she maintained the same calm composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the day, occasionally making brief notes on a small pad of paper, but never displaying the emotional reactions that Marcus's cruel words seemed designed to provoke. Her stillness suggested either complete resignation to defeat or confident awareness of information that no one else in the courtroom possessed. During a brief recess, Vanessa approached Marcus with barely contained excitement about their future plans, her voice carrying clearly enough for Elena to overhear discussions about redecorating, entertaining, and the sophisticated social life they would build together. Marcus encouraged this display with the satisfaction of a man demonstrating his power to replace one woman with a younger, more beautiful alternative who would appreciate luxuries that Elena had simply taken for granted. What none of them noticed was the brief phone call that interrupted Thomas Mitchell's frantic preparation during the recess, a conversation that lasted less than 3 minutes, but seemed to transform the nervous public defender into someone with a different kind of purpose. His hands stopped shaking as he listened to instructions delivered in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, and when he returned to the courtroom, his entire demeanor had shifted from desperate defense to confident anticipation. Elena observed this transformation with the first genuine smile she had displayed since entering the courthouse, a brief expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this development. Her mysterious calm throughout the morning's proceedings suddenly made sense to anyone who understood that she had been playing a role as carefully constructed as any professional performance, allowing Marcus to build his confidence to dangerous heights while more powerful forces prepared to enter the battle on her behalf. The afternoon session would resume in 10 minutes, and Marcus Caldwell had no idea that his moment of ultimate triumph was about to become the beginning of his complete destruction. Marcus Caldwell returned to the courtroom after recess with the swagger of a general who had just witnessed his enemy's complete surrender, his confidence so absolute that he barely noticed the subtle shift in Thomas Mitchell's demeanor or the way Elena's mysterious calm had transformed into something that resembled quiet anticipation. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor as Marcus prepared to deliver what he intended to be the killing blow that would leave Elena with nothing but regret and a harsh lesson about challenging men who possessed real power. Jonathan Brewster had prepared the final phase of their legal assault with the precision of a surgeon removing a malignant tumor, and Marcus could barely contain his satisfaction as his attorney organized documents that would request Elena pay his substantial legal fees in addition to forfeiting any claim to marital assets. The strategy was designed not merely to win the divorce proceedings, but to inflict such complete financial devastation that Elena would spend years recovering from the audacity of believing she deserved anything from their marriage. The request for legal fees was presented with clinical efficiency, Jonathan explaining to Judge Richardson that Elena's frivolous claims had forced Marcus to incur substantial expenses defending assets that were clearly protected by their prenuptial agreement. The amount was staggering: $47,000 for Jonathan's services, plus additional costs for financial analysis, witness preparation, and court filing fees that brought the total to nearly $60,000. For a woman whose bank account had never exceeded $3,000, this debt would represent a financial death sentence. Marcus rose to address the court directly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to speak and be heard in any forum. He described the emotional toll of Elena's unrealistic expectations, painting himself as the victim of a woman who had attempted to destroy his reputation and business relationships through what he termed vindictive legal harassment. His words were carefully chosen to suggest that Elena had pursued divorce proceedings not from any legitimate grievance, but from simple greed and resentment over his relationship with Vanessa. The most devastating attack came when Marcus addressed Elena's character directly, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining reality to a particularly slow child. He suggested that Elena should feel grateful for 15 years of financial security and social elevation that had lifted her far above the modest circumstances of her family background. Any reasonable woman, Marcus explained, would recognize that her marriage to him had been the greatest opportunity of her lifetime and would gracefully accept the generous terms of their prenuptial agreement. Marcus's cruelty reached its peak when he suggested that Elena's inability to contribute meaningfully to their marriage had been evident from the beginning, describing her as fundamentally unsuited for the sophisticated social and business environment she had entered through marriage. His words carried the casual dismissal of someone discarding a piece of furniture that had served its purpose, and several observers actually flinched at the calculated harshness of his character assassination. Vanessa Sterling watched this performance from the gallery with undisguised satisfaction, her designer outfit and perfect makeup serving as a visual reminder of Elena's replacement. She had already begun mentally cataloging Elena's belongings that would need to be removed from the house, planning yard sales and donation drives that would erase every trace of the woman who had occupied her future home for 15 years. Her youth and beauty represented everything that Elena had lost, and Vanessa took obvious pleasure in serving as living proof of Marcus's power to replace and upgrade when his current model became unsatisfactory. Thomas Mitchell appeared increasingly overwhelmed as Marcus's testimony continued, his nervous energy contrasting sharply with Jonathan's polished presentation and Marcus's confident authority. His attempts to object were weak and poorly timed, reinforcing the narrative that Elena's legal representation was completely outmatched by the resources Marcus had assembled. Even sympathetic observers began to accept that they were witnessing a legal execution rather than a fair contest between equal opponents. But Elena herself continued to display the same mysterious calm that had characterized her behavior throughout the proceedings, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the immediate humiliation being inflicted upon her character and prospects. She made occasional notes on her small pad of paper, her handwriting neat and controlled despite the systematic destruction of her reputation taking place just feet away. Her composure suggested either complete resignation to defeat or confident knowledge of information that would soon transform the entire proceeding. The pivotal moment came when Marcus demanded that Judge Richardson order Elena to publicly acknowledge her frivolous pursuit of assets she had never earned, a final humiliation designed to serve as both punishment and warning to other women who might consider challenging powerful men. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering a perfectly executed checkmate, certain that Elena would be forced to stand before the court and admit her worthlessness in terms that would satisfy his need for complete dominance. Marcus's confidence reached dangerous heights as he described Elena's future prospects with barely concealed contempt, suggesting that she would need to find employment suitable for someone with her limited skills and education. His recommendations included retail positions, food service, or perhaps domestic work that would provide sufficient income to pay the legal fees she owed while maintaining the modest lifestyle appropriate to someone of her actual social position. Each suggestion was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone crushing an insect beneath his heel. During this peak moment of Marcus's triumph, a sleek black sedan pulled quietly into the courthouse parking lot, its tinted windows and diplomatic license plates suggesting occupants of considerable importance. The vehicle's arrival went unnoticed by Marcus and his supporters, who were too focused on savoring Elena's systematic destruction to pay attention to external developments that might threaten their moment of victory. The sedan's passenger door opened to reveal a distinguished man in his early 60s, his silver hair perfectly styled and his charcoal suit clearly tailored by craftsmen who charged more for alterations than most people earned in a month. Charles Whitmore carried himself with the effortless authority of someone accustomed to boardrooms where billion-dollar decisions were made with handshakes, and his leather briefcase bore the subtle markings of a law firm whose clients included Fortune 500 companies and foreign governments. Charles entered the courthouse with the measured pace of someone who had appeared before judges in jurisdictions around the world, his presence commanding attention from court officials who recognized the unmistakable signs of serious legal firepower. His shoes clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that suggested confidence built on decades of victories in cases where the stakes had been measured in hundreds of millions of dollars rather than the relatively modest sums being disputed in Courtroom 4. Inside the courtroom, Marcus continued his verbal assault on Elena's character and prospects, completely unaware that the balance of power was about to shift in ways that would transform his moment of triumph into the beginning of his complete humiliation. His voice carried clearly through the courthouse corridors as he described Elena's complete dependence on his generosity and her utter unsuitability for any meaningful role in sophisticated society. Thomas Mitchell's transformation during recess had been subtle but significant, his nervous energy replaced by quiet anticipation that suggested he was no longer fighting alone against overwhelming odds. His posture had straightened, his hands had stopped shaking, and his attention was focused on the courtroom doors rather than Marcus's continuing testimony. The phone call during recess had clearly delivered news that had changed everything about his approach to the case. Elena's reaction to Marcus's escalating cruelty remained puzzlingly calm, her dark eyes occasionally glancing toward the courtroom entrance as if she were expecting someone whose arrival would change the entire nature of the proceedings. Her mysterious composure throughout hours of systematic character assassination suddenly seemed less like resignation and more like the patience of someone waiting for reinforcements whose power would dwarf anything Marcus could imagine. The courthouse clock struck 3 in the afternoon, just as Marcus reached the climax of his demands for complete financial and social dominance, his voice echoing through the marble corridors with the confidence of someone who had never experienced defeat in any contest that mattered to him. Vanessa leaned forward in her seat, eager to witness Elena's final humiliation and the moment when Marcus would achieve total victory over the woman who had dared to challenge his absolute authority. But the heavy oak doors at the rear of the courtroom were about to open, and the man who entered would carry with him the power to transform Marcus's moment of ultimate triumph into the beginning of a fall so complete and devastating that his entire understanding of reality would crumble within minutes. Elena Moreau had spent 15 years allowing Marcus to underestimate her, and the patience of a woman who had been raised in circles where power was measured in generations rather than quarterly earnings was about to be revealed in all its terrible magnificence. The game was about to change completely, and Marcus Caldwell had no idea that his greatest moment of triumph was actually his final moment of ignorance before learning who Elena really was. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4 opened with a whisper that somehow commanded more attention than Marcus's booming voice had managed throughout the entire afternoon, and Charles Whitmore entered with the measured confidence of a man who had represented heads of state in international tribunals. His presence immediately altered the atmosphere of the courtroom, drawing glances from court officials who recognized the subtle signs of serious legal firepower walking into what they had assumed was a routine divorce proceeding between mismatched opponents. Marcus paused mid-sentence in his character assassination of Elena, his instincts warning him that something fundamental had just changed, even though his conscious mind had not yet processed what that change might mean. Charles approached the defense table with unhurried precision, his handcrafted Italian shoes silent against the courtroom floor as he set his leather briefcase beside Thomas Mitchell with the casual authority of someone taking command of a situation that had been temporarily managed by subordinates. Judge Richardson looked up from his notes with the sharp attention of someone who had presided over enough high-stakes litigation to recognize when heavyweight legal talent had entered his courtroom. Charles's reputation preceded him in legal circles where billion-dollar settlements were negotiated and international business disputes were resolved with handshakes that carried more weight than most written contracts. His presence in a suburban divorce court was so unexpected that it immediately signaled that something significant was about to unfold. Elena's demeanor shifted for the first time since entering the courthouse, her mysterious calm giving way to quiet confidence as she acknowledged Charles's arrival with a slight nod that carried years of shared history and mutual respect. The woman who had sat silently through hours of systematic humiliation suddenly straightened in her chair, her posture transforming from apparent defeat to dignified authority, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment to reveal her true nature. Charles opened his briefcase with movements so economical and precise that they drew attention from every person in the courtroom, extracting documents that bore the letterhead of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates, a firm whose client list included multinational corporations and foreign governments. His voice, when he spoke, carried the cultured accent of someone educated at institutions where tuition exceeded the annual income of most American families, and his words were chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to consequences measured in hundreds of millions of dollars. "Your Honor," Charles began, his voice cutting through the courtroom atmosphere like a blade through silk, "I am Charles Whitmore, representing Mrs. Elena Moreau in these proceedings. I apologize for my delayed arrival, as I was completing urgent business in Geneva that required my personal attention. I trust the court will allow me a few moments to review the claims that have been presented against my client before we proceed with what I believe will be a very different discussion than has taken place this afternoon." Marcus felt his confidence falter for the first time since entering the courthouse, his business instincts warning him that something fundamental had shifted in ways he did not yet understand. Jonathan Brewster's expression showed the first signs of concern as he recognized Charles's name from legal publications and realized that Elena's public defender had been replaced by someone whose hourly rate exceeded his own by several $100s. The David and Goliath narrative that had defined the morning's proceedings had suddenly become far more complicated. Charles spent exactly 90 seconds reviewing the documents that Thomas Mitchell had compiled, his trained eye absorbing information with the efficiency of someone who had mastered complex international law during decades of high-stakes litigation. When he looked up from his review, his expression carried the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed that his opponents had walked directly into a trap they had constructed for themselves through their own arrogance and carelessness. The first document Charles extracted from his briefcase was a portfolio bearing the seal of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, its heavyweight paper and official formatting immediately commanding attention from Judge Richardson, who recognized the significance of documentation that originated from institutions where America's monetary policy was crafted. Charles presented this evidence with the casual authority of someone producing a document that would fundamentally alter every assumption that had been made about Elena's financial position and legal standing. "Mr. Caldwell has spent considerable time today describing my client's alleged financial dependence and lack of contribution to their marriage, Charles observed, his voice carrying the understated authority of someone presenting facts rather than arguments. I believe the court will find his characterizations somewhat incomplete once we review the actual financial circumstances that have existed throughout their relationship. Mrs. Moreau has remained silent this afternoon, not from defeat or resignation, but from the patience of someone who preferred to allow her opponents to fully reveal their positions before presenting evidence that will prove rather illuminating. The document Charles placed before Judge Richardson was Elena's individual trust fund statement, established in her maiden name 23 years earlier and maintained independently throughout her marriage in accordance with the legal structures designed to protect generational wealth from exactly the kind of predatory behavior Marcus had demonstrated throughout their relationship. The account balance, certified by federal banking authorities and verified by international auditing firms, showed assets totaling $53 million that had never been commingled with marital property. Marcus's confident smile disappeared completely as Charles read the account balance aloud, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone presenting routine financial information rather than earth-shattering revelations. $53 million represented more wealth than Marcus had accumulated through 15 years of business expansion, and the trust structure protecting these assets had been designed by legal experts whose expertise in protecting generational wealth far exceeded anything Marcus had encountered in his relatively modest business dealings. Vanessa Sterling's face went pale as she processed the implications of this revelation, her plans for redecorating and social elevation crumbling as she realized that the woman she had assumed was financially desperate actually possessed wealth that dwarfed Marcus's considerable fortune. The comfortable lifestyle she had anticipated sharing with Marcus would represent a significant step down from what Elena had been voluntarily living as a choice rather than necessity. Jonathan Brewster's professional composure cracked as he realized that his entire legal strategy had been based on fundamentally incorrect assumptions about Elena's financial position and legal standing. The prenuptial agreement he had been counting on to protect Marcus's assets would provide no protection against claims arising from Elena's separate property, and the characterizations of financial dependence he had spent hours presenting to the court had just been revealed as either ignorant or deliberately misleading. But Charles was far from finished with his presentation, and the trust fund documentation was merely the opening move in a chess game where Elena had been positioning her pieces for 15 years while Marcus had been playing checkers with rules he had never bothered to understand. The next document bore the letterhead of the Department of Commerce and detailed the federal registration of businesses that would further illuminate the true balance of power in the relationship Marcus had assumed he dominated. Mrs. Moreau's family operates Moreau International Holdings, Charles continued, his voice maintaining the same conversational tone as if he were discussing routine business matters rather than revelations that were systematically destroying every assumption Marcus had made about his wife and his marriage. The company was founded by her grandfather in 1847 and currently maintains business relationships in 37 countries, with particular expertise in the import and export markets that Mr. Caldwell's company has been attempting to penetrate for the past 8 years. The implications of this revelation struck Marcus like a physical blow as he realized that Elena's family controlled access to the international markets that represented his primary avenue for business expansion. Every deal he had struggled to negotiate, every relationship he had fought to establish, every contract he had pursued with increasing desperation had been within Elena's power to facilitate or destroy with a single phone call to relatives whose business networks spanned continents. Charles presented documentation showing that Moreau International Holdings maintained controlling interests in 17 companies that competed directly with Caldwell Industries, including 3 firms that had consistently underbid Marcus on contracts he had assumed were lost due to his own inadequate preparation or insufficient industry connections. Elena had spent 15 years watching her husband struggle against obstacles that existed only because she had chosen to allow him to succeed or fail based on his own merits rather than her family's influence. Elena spoke for the first time since Charles had entered the courtroom, her voice carrying an authority that had been completely absent during hours of systematic humiliation but had clearly been present all along beneath the surface of her carefully maintained facade. "Marcus," she said, her tone conversational but firm, You spent our entire marriage assuming I was lucky to have married above my station. You never bothered to investigate my actual background because your arrogance convinced you that any woman would be grateful for your attention regardless of her own circumstances. The courtroom fell silent as Elena's transformation from apparent victim to revealed authority figure became complete, her posture straight and her voice clear as she addressed the man who had spent 15 years treating her as an ornament whose only value lay in her beauty and compliance. Marcus stared at her with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been revealed as fantasy, his confident assumptions crumbling as the woman he thought he knew disappeared forever. Charles consulted his notes with professional calm as he prepared to present evidence that would complete the destruction of Marcus's legal position and reveal the full extent of Elena's patience during 15 years of marriage to a man whose arrogance had blinded him to the power he had married into, and then systematically abused through his own ignorance and cruelty. Charles Whitmore's next document bore the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission, its federal authentication stamps and regulatory approval numbers indicating that what he was about to reveal had been subject to the highest levels of government scrutiny and verification. Marcus watched with growing horror as Charles presented evidence that would not only destroy his understanding of Elena's background, but would reveal him as a man who had spent 15 years insulting and dismissing someone whose family wielded economic power on an international scale. The SEC filing documented Morrow International Holdings as a privately held conglomerate with verified assets exceeding $2 billion, distributed across shipping, manufacturing, and financial services companies that operated on 6 continents. Elena's family name appeared on corporate boards that controlled supply chains essential to industries ranging from electronics manufacturing to pharmaceutical production, and their business relationships included partnerships with governments and corporations whose decisions affected global markets. Marcus felt his world tilting as Charles explained that Elena's modest childhood, which Marcus had used as evidence of her inferior background, had actually been a deliberate choice by parents who believed their children should understand financial responsibility before inheriting access to generational wealth. The bankruptcy of Elena's parents' small import business had been a calculated decision to liquidate a minor subsidiary while protecting the family's primary assets from a regulatory investigation that ultimately proved baseless but required temporary financial restructuring. Elena's education at public institutions had similarly been a family tradition designed to ensure that each generation understood how ordinary people lived before assuming positions of responsibility within the family's business empire. Her entry-level jobs had been part of a comprehensive training program that required all family members to demonstrate competence in basic business operations before being granted access to positions where their decisions would affect thousands of employees and millions of dollars in international commerce. Charles presented documentation showing that Elena had maintained detailed records of Marcus's business activities throughout their marriage, not from suspicious surveillance, but from professional interest in monitoring a company whose growth trajectory intersected with several Morrow international subsidiaries. Her apparent lack of involvement in his business decisions had actually been careful observation designed to evaluate his competence and character before determining whether their marriage represented a suitable foundation for closer business cooperation between their families. The most devastating revelation came in the form of correspondence between Elena and her family's board of directors, documenting 15 years of discussions about Marcus's business practices and personal character that had ultimately led to their unanimous decision to exclude Caldwell Industries from consideration for partnerships that would have increased his company's value by an estimated 300%. Elena's family had watched Marcus struggle in markets they controlled while she endured his increasing arrogance and cruelty, waiting to see if he would demonstrate the integrity and wisdom necessary for integration into their business network. Marcus realized with growing horror that Elena's family had essentially been testing him throughout their marriage, evaluating his character through his treatment of someone he believed to be powerless and dependent on his generosity. His failure of this test had been documented in corporate records that would ensure Caldwell Industries remained permanently excluded from the international markets his company desperately needed for continued growth and expansion. Jonathan Brewster attempted to challenge the authenticity of Charles's documentation, but his objections were quickly overruled when Charles produced verification letters from federal banking authorities, international auditing firms, and regulatory agencies in 7 countries. The evidence of Elena's financial position and family influence had been prepared by institutions whose credibility exceeded anything Marcus's legal team could possibly challenge, and each document bore authentication marks that confirmed its accuracy through independent government verification. Elena's transformation from apparent victim to revealed authority figure became complete as she addressed Marcus directly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone whose patience had finally been rewarded with the opportunity to speak truth to someone who had spent years abusing assumed power. "Marcus," she said, her tone conversational but implacable, "my family has been monitoring your business practices since our 2nd year of marriage. We hoped you might demonstrate the wisdom and character necessary for closer cooperation, but your treatment of employees, business partners, and ultimately me convinced us that you were fundamentally unsuitable for integration into our operations." The documentation Charles presented next showed that Marcus's most significant business failures had resulted directly from Morrow International's quiet opposition to his expansion efforts, not from his own inadequate preparation or insufficient industry connections. Elena's family had used their influence to ensure that Marcus succeeded or failed based on his own merits rather than his marriage connection, but they had also prevented him from accessing markets where his documented history of exploiting workers and manipulating contracts would have caused problems for their own business relationships. Marcus's business associates, who had been nodding approvingly at his dominance display throughout the morning, now sat in stunned silence as they realized the implications of Elena's revealed identity for their own professional relationships. Several of them had been pursuing contracts with companies that were now revealed to be Morrow International subsidiaries, and their association with Marcus's treatment of Elena would likely eliminate any possibility of future business cooperation with one of the most influential family networks in international commerce. Vanessa Sterling fled the courtroom during this revelation phase, her dreams of social elevation and financial security evaporating as she realized that Marcus's wealth and status were insignificant compared to what Elena had voluntarily abandoned to marry him. The comfortable lifestyle Vanessa had anticipated sharing with Marcus would represent poverty compared to the resources Elena had chosen to ignore while enduring 15 years of systematic disrespect from a man whose business empire existed only because her family had chosen not to destroy it. Charles presented Elena's prenuptial agreement, signed 15 years earlier under circumstances that Marcus had assumed demonstrated his superior legal preparation and Elena's naive trust in his generosity. However, the document had actually been drafted by Elena's family attorneys and deliberately structured to protect her separate assets, while allowing Marcus to believe he had achieved comprehensive protection for his relatively modest wealth. Every clause Marcus had celebrated as evidence of his legal sophistication had actually been designed to serve Elena's interests while maintaining the fiction that she was financially dependent on his continued goodwill. The most humiliating revelation came when Charles presented documentation of Elena's charitable activities throughout their marriage, funded entirely through her trust fund, and carried out without any publicity or recognition from the social circles where Marcus had been building his reputation. Elena had donated more money to educational and social causes during their marriage than Marcus had earned through his business activities, but she had maintained complete discretion about her philanthropy to avoid undermining his assumed role as the family's primary breadwinner. Judge Richardson reviewed the documentation with the careful attention of someone who recognized that he was witnessing one of the most complete reversals of assumed power dynamics he had encountered in decades of presiding over family court proceedings. The evidence presented by Charles was so comprehensive and well-documented that it left no room for dispute about Elena's actual financial position or the true balance of power in her relationship with Marcus. Elena's final statement to Marcus carried the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patience had been rewarded with the opportunity to educate a man whose arrogance had prevented him from recognizing reality throughout their marriage. "You spent 15 years treating me as if I were lucky to have married above my station," she said, her voice calm but firm. You never bothered to learn who I actually was because your assumptions convinced you that any woman would be grateful for your attention regardless of her own circumstances. My family has been watching and evaluating your character through your treatment of someone you believe had no power to resist your cruelty. Marcus sat in complete silence as the full scope of his miscalculation became clear, his confident assumptions about Elena's background and his own superior position revealed as fantasy built on arrogance rather than investigation. The woman he had spent 15 years treating as a dependent ornament had actually been the most powerful person in their relationship, and her patience during his systematic abuse had been the forbearance of someone whose family could have destroyed his business with a single phone call, but had chosen to let him succeed or fail based on his own character and competence. Charles organized his papers with NAL satisfaction as he prepared to present the final phase of evidence that would complete Marcus's legal destruction and establish the terms under which Elena would exit their marriage with her dignity restored and her true position finally acknowledged by the man whose arrogance had blinded him to reality for 15 years. Judge Richardson's gavel struck the bench with the finality of thunder as he delivered his verdict, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had witnessed the complete collapse of one party's legal position in favor of evidence, so overwhelming that any other outcome would have been a mockery of justice. The prenuptial agreement that Marcus had celebrated as his protection against Elena's claims was declared null and void due to the fraudulent misrepresentation of both parties' actual financial circumstances, leaving Marcus exposed to claims he had never imagined possible. Elena was awarded immediate restoration of her separate property rights, including full control of trust fund assets that Marcus had never known existed and legal recognition of her family's business holdings that had been deliberately concealed throughout their marriage. The judge's ruling made clear that Elena's apparent financial dependence had been a voluntary choice rather than actual necessity, and that her patient endurance of Marcus's systematic cruelty had been the forbearance of someone who possessed the power to destroy him, but had chosen to allow him the opportunity to demonstrate his true character. The most devastating blow came when Judge Richardson addressed Marcus's demand that Elena pay his legal fees, explaining with barely concealed contempt that a man who had spent hours describing his wife's worthlessness while remaining ignorant of her actual wealth and influence had forfeited any claim to sympathy or financial consideration. Instead, Marcus would be required to pay Elena's legal expenses, including Charles Whitmore's substantial fees for services that had been necessary only because of Marcus's fraudulent characterization of their respective financial positions. Charles presented his final exhibit with the satisfaction of a master chess player delivering checkmate, extracting documents that revealed Marcus's business practices had been under investigation by federal authorities for violations of international trade regulations. Elena's family had been cooperating with this investigation for 18 months, providing evidence of Marcus's attempts to circumvent import restrictions and manipulate currency exchange rates in ways that violated both American law and international commerce agreements. Marcus watched in horror as Charles explained that Elena's detailed documentation of his business activities, which she had maintained throughout their marriage, would now be made available to federal prosecutors who were building a case for criminal charges that could result in substantial fines and possible imprisonment. The woman Marcus had dismissed as irrelevant to his business success had actually been creating a comprehensive record of his illegal activities that would ensure his company faced federal sanctions regardless of the outcome of their divorce proceedings. The business associates who had supported Marcus throughout the morning's character assassination of Elena now fled the courtroom with the speed of men whose own companies faced potential federal investigation for their participation in Marcus's illegal import schemes. Their earlier confidence in Marcus's business acumen had transformed into panic about their own legal exposure, and their abandonment of their former ally was so swift and complete that Marcus found himself completely isolated within minutes of the judge's verdict. Elena's transformation from apparent victim to revealed authority figure reached its culmination as she addressed Marcus for the final time, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone whose patience had been rewarded with the complete vindication of her character and position. "Marcus," she said, her tone conversational but implacable, "you spent our entire marriage believing you had married beneath yourself. You treated me with contempt because you assumed I was dependent on your generosity and grateful for whatever attention you chose to provide. You never bothered to discover who I actually was because your arrogance convinced you that any woman would be fortunate to share your life regardless of her own circumstances. The final humiliation came when Elena revealed that her family had been aware of Marcus's affairs throughout their marriage, including his relationship with Vanessa Sterling that he had assumed was conducted with perfect secrecy. Morrow International's security personnel had documented every meeting, every gift, and every promise Marcus had made to his mistress, creating a record that would be made available to federal investigators as evidence of his character and judgment in business relationships that required trust and discretion. Vanessa Sterling's return to the courtroom during the final proceedings provided a moment of dark comedy, as she discovered that the man she had planned to marry was now facing federal criminal charges and complete financial ruin. Her attempts to distance herself from Marcus were so transparent and desperate that even sympathetic observers found themselves disgusted by her calculated abandonment of someone she had claimed to love when his wealth and status had seemed secure. Marcus's expensive lawyer Jonathan Brewster quietly withdrew from representation during the final phase of proceedings, explaining to Judge Richardson that his client's fraudulent misrepresentation of the case circumstances had created ethical conflicts that prevented continued legal advocacy. Jonathan's abandonment of Marcus in his moment of greatest need demonstrated how completely the power dynamics had shifted, leaving Marcus to face federal criminal charges and financial ruin without the legal support he had assumed his wealth would always provide. Elena emerged from the courthouse with the quiet dignity of someone whose true character had finally been revealed after years of deliberate concealment, her transformation from apparent victim to acknowledged authority figure complete in every way that mattered. The modest navy dress and worn leather purse that had marked her as financially vulnerable earlier in the day now appeared to be the confident choices of someone whose actual wealth was so secure that she felt no need to display it through expensive clothing or ostentatious accessories. Charles Whitmore accompanied Elena to her family's car, an understated luxury vehicle whose diplomatic license plates and discreet security features suggested occupants whose influence extended far beyond the suburban courthouse, where Marcus's arrogance had finally met consequences commensurate with 15 years of systematic cruelty and willful ignorance. Elena's patient endurance of her husband's abuse had been the forbearance of someone whose family could have destroyed him at any moment, but had chosen to allow him the opportunity to demonstrate whether he possessed the character worthy of integration into their business network. Marcus sat alone in the empty courtroom as afternoon shadows lengthened across the polished floor, his confident assumptions about power and privilege revealed as fantasy built on ignorance rather than understanding. The woman he had spent 15 years treating as a dependent ornament had actually been the most influential person in their relationship, and her patience during his systematic abuse had been the mercy of someone whose family controlled resources that dwarfed his modest business empire. The final irony emerged in the weeks following the divorce decree, as Marcus discovered that his company's primary creditors were subsidiaries of Morrow International Holdings that Elena's family had strategically positioned to ensure his business faced immediate financial pressure once her protection was withdrawn. Elena had spent their marriage quietly shielding Marcus from the full consequences of his business practices, allowing him to succeed within limits that prevented damage to her family's extensive business relationships, while he remained unaware of the protection she was providing. Federal investigators arrived at Caldwell Industries headquarters exactly 1 week after the divorce decree was finalized, armed with search warrants based on evidence that Elena's family had been accumulating for 18 months while she endured Marcus's increasing arrogance and cruelty with the patience of someone whose ultimate vindication was inevitable. Marcus's arrest on charges of international trade fraud and currency manipulation marked the complete destruction of a man whose arrogance had blinded him to the reality that he had been married to someone whose family possessed the power to protect or destroy him based entirely on his treatment of their daughter. Elena's final act of mercy came in the form of a letter delivered to Marcus in federal custody, explaining that her family's investigation had been motivated not by vindictiveness, but by their responsibility to protect international business relationships from the damage his illegal practices might have caused. She had endured 15 years of systematic disrespect while documenting his character and business practices, hoping he might demonstrate the wisdom and integrity necessary for integration into their global network of trusted partners. The letter concluded with Elena's acknowledgement that Marcus had failed this test completely through his treatment of someone he believed had no power to resist his cruelty, and that her family's decision to exclude him permanently from their business network had been based on his demonstrated inability to recognize and respect power when it chose to present itself with humility rather than ostentation. Marcus had spent 15 years married to one of the most powerful women in international commerce while treating her as a dependent ornament, and his punishment would be spending the rest of his life understanding exactly what his arrogance had cost him. If you enjoyed watching this arrogant man get exactly what he deserved, I want to know what you thought about Elena's incredible patience and planning. Have you ever had to deal with someone who underestimated you because of how you looked or where you came from? Share your thoughts in the comments below about how satisfying it was to see Marcus finally learn who he had really married. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where justice comes for those who think their money makes them untouchable.